Daar's hy.
Okay, so it's good to go. Right. I will say good morning. Okay. Good day. Welcome to the Tropics Business Summit. Heino and I will discuss investing in clean energy and share our thoughts with our audience. My name is Corrie van Wath. I'm from Matleng Energy Solutions, and my co-presenter is Heino.
I'm Heino van Jaarsveldt. I'm from Quantum Professional Services.
So Heino, let's start with investment in clean. When you hear the word investment and clean, those are the two key words. Clean, obviously, we're not going to go into it's any source of energy that obviously doesn't damage the earth or our environment. If you look at the word investment, how would you define and look at investment in green?
Well, Corrie, I think if you want to invest in green, I think there's a few outcomes to consider. Either you want to invest in clean to get a return on your capital investment, or you want to invest to ensure you have a security in your supply. You can also invest in clean to reduce your carbon footprint. And also from 2019 in South Africa, with the introduction of carbon taxes, there's also tax incentives to consider when you invest in clean. So I think those are the four main points to consider when you want to invest in clean.
And I think the point we also want to make is investment, to everyone's mind, is normally the return on money. And if you look at in the latest, and I'm under correction, statistics of how we protect our environment, we are currently consuming the earth at about between 2 and 3 times what it can afford us as humans, which is a far higher price. But because it's in the future, we don't really put huge emphasis, and we rather always tend to go back to affordability of a supply. Because when you have, if you're in the private sector and you have a factory or you have an offtake, your input cost is obviously, the energy input cost is huge. And the most pressing one is to make your business profitable. That pays salaries, that makes sure that you're there tomorrow. So that, I think, as an essence, also places huge, let's say, pressure on whether we go for greener energy. At this stage, according to my resources, are more expensive if you don't include the tax rebates. So let's move on. So we're going to chat about the investment into green with a broader eye on it, rather than just to look at money. Before we start, how do we measure our investment in green? There's also 3 terms that's been used regularly: grid connected, off grid, hybrid. Just your take on those 3 terms, Heino.
Okay, if we consider the South African context, I think we can all agree that grid refers to the Eskom grid, or if you're a secondary user on a municipality grid, so that's the electricity currently generated in South Africa. So if you have a grid-tied system, you either have a renewable or alternative source that's, as it mentions, tied to the grid. So you either have your renewable source as your primary source with the grid as backup, or the other way around. If you have an off-grid system, you're completely off of the grid. You have only your renewable source as your primary source of energy, or your only source of energy. And with that, you also have to consider that you might lose some of your diversity, because you actually generate and you consume. So you are a one-for-one player in that space.
Yeah, so your source addresses your load profile.
That's correct, yes. And then if you have a hybrid system, hybrid can refer to multiple terminologies, but I think in the sense of the discussion for today, hybrid will refer to a mix of energy sources. So you might have a grid source, you might have a PV source, and also a gas to power source. Then the mix of that addresses your load profile and acts as a hybrid energy source.
Okay, thank you, Heino. I think moving on to the next one, if we measure investment, and I think for now, let's put environmental and security of supply one side, and you purely look at your return on your investment, because as I said earlier, the off-taker has a load profile, and there's a certain amount of money that needs to be paid towards having energy. And how do I measure? Why is it so difficult to just take a cookie cutter or one size fits all approach to why don't I just install PV? and say, okay, I'm going to go green. PV is the cheapest without storage. Why is it so difficult not to go that route?
Okay, I think a term that we use in the renewable energy space is LCOE. And the LCOE, what it stands for is the levelized cost of energy, and I'll explain just briefly what that stands for. But it's basically a method to compare energy sources like for like. So with LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, you compare the cost of producing a single form of energy, kilowatt hour, over the lifetime of the plant. So it's basically you take all your capital input and you divide that into the total energy produced over the lifetime of the plant. So you have to consider various inputs in that model. You have to consider the capital expenditure, the O&M cost, to be able to get to a like-for-like comparison on a rand per kilowatt hour. Now, as you just mentioned, some renewable sources are obviously more expensive than the traditional coal-fired power stations that we have in South Africa, but obviously the renewable energy has a much less impact on our carbon footprint. So there's
so what you're saying, this LCOE is like when you decide to buy a house or to rent a house, it's the total cost to occupy that house, and every house would have a different LCOE, because if you buy a big house, the maintenance will be more, the bond might be more. So it's sort of to say, if I have to acquire something which I see as essential, like buying a house, what will the end cost, all inclusive, be if I want to compare buying versus renting, in terms of what's the real cost in terms of monetary value of my investment and return?
Yes, yeah, I think that's an accurate description to explain it like that, and yeah, I think that's actually very accurate and paints the picture exactly what you need to consider when comparing renewable energy sources with currently the grid.
And I know when you buy a house, I mean, there are most probably between 20 to 100 things to locality, the children, the schools, what's close, what's not close, shops. Is it far simpler in the selecting green energy, or is it also fairly complicated?
It's very complicated, Corrie. LCOE is one of actually 25 points that we look at when we decide should a client invest in green. LCOE, like you said, is only one thing. You might end up with, for example, just to take example, PV, which has currently, considering a few energy sources, the lowest LCOE. But PV is also very directly related to the weather. If you have an overcast day, you can't produce any power. So you also have to consider...
And sorry for being in your soup. Also, if you just take South Africa, wind in South Africa is most probably far better in the coastal areas than in Johannesburg. PV might be far better here, and if you have, let's say, 10% less radiation on your PV, it means if you move to that space, you need to add 10% more panels.
Yes, that's exactly, yeah.
And it's also seasonal, because when it's rainy season, you are obviously going to get less out of your source than you'll get for your investment when it's full sunshine days.
Yeah, so from what you just said, you literally already touched on 3 of the 25 points, your LCOE, your locality, and your load profile. So it's actually very difficult. It's not, like you said at the beginning of the conversation as well, there's no real cookie cutter recipe. You have to meet with the client, understand the client's needs, and address that by looking at all 25 points. Before you can even decide on what technology you have to use, you have to run through the 25 points and make sure that you address the client's specific needs.
Yeah. And just to recap, those 25 points specifically refer to an optimized investment.
That's
which also, part of optimized investment means EEDSM. You have to firstly make your plant efficient and optimize, in our terms we call it intelligent utilization of all your equipment, to lower your demand before you actually try and build the capacity and you haven't cleaned up your own act, if I can call it that way.
Yes, that's definitely true, yeah. Yeah, and like I said, that's actually the first point in addressing the client's needs. And only by understanding the client's needs can you actually start the whole process and to give the client a specific energy mix to address their specific needs.
Very happy. Back to LCOE. So what you're saying is different energy types have different costs to them in terms of their lifespan per kilowatt hour. If you look at the cheaper ones, let's take tax rebates out of the scenario, because that obviously applies to any green footprint, and it can make something more workable than something else. But low profiles also play a huge role in terms of when do I need my power, and let me use an example as a macro. Their biggest demand is most probably when the sun shines. If I have a smelter, I might have a 24-hour operation, which means I run baseload at the extent that I need it 24 hours, and there are no sun to date at night. So that also hampers this whole thing. Just elaborate a little bit on the LCOE principle of the different sources, because that's a part of our discussion. And we've got 30 seconds to do that.
Okay, so if you look at just purely LCOE, currently in South Africa, considering a few renewable energy sources, PV without storage is by far, especially on utility scale, talking about typically 50 megawatt capacity plants. LCOE or for a PV plant is in the region of 75 cents, so that's typically your lowest source of renewable energy based on an LCOE model. Whereas gas to power, you're talking about in the region of 250 for the same scale plant. Now, the big difference between the two comes to one point, and that's security of supply. Like you also said, you can't really control PV. PV can't run baseload, whereas with gas you can run baseload. So it's very important to not only consider the LCOE, but also to take it into comparison with what your needs are based on your security of supply.
Yeah, and obviously what you produce, because there are certain things you can optimize and certain things like smelters, when it's on, it's on. And it also, I think one of your 25 points is also to look at the startup of plants. I mean, if you have a gas supply that runs generators, it's far easier to start up and down, but it's, if you look at a power station, you can't start it up and stop it, start it up and stop it. So all the resources and the sources also have their own, let's call it, characteristics around cost. So if you want to cut peaks and the peak only runs twice a day, it's very difficult to start up and cut down. But Heino, thank you for your time, and I think thank you for Tropics Business Summit as well. We need to discuss these, and I think one of the things that are totally underestimated about why are we not going so fast on replacing dirty fuels with renewable or clean is there are so many parameters that come into play when you want to make an accurate, good investment. And we will advise anyone who puts money into the investments to really do their homework well. There are tariff systems that apply. You obviously have a current connection to a grid. That relationship can also change in terms of cost. It can go up or down. In South Africa, the feeling is generally going up, but it's not necessary that. So do all your calculations. If you need any assistance, find below our contact details and be in contact and really just do your homework. And I think if someone says, I have a 100% solution for you, they haven't maybe done all the homework they should have done, as there are many questions to ask before you invest. I thank you for your time. Thanks, Heino.
Thank you, Corrie.